All right, welcome back to Intro to Cognitive Science. Last time we did a little bit of a skip and hop over some neural networking concepts. Hope it wasn't too incomprehensible. But today we're going to skip and hop over a couple more concepts that are pretty important for you to walk away with, especially if you're interested in cognitive science as a major. So let's talk about modularity and dynamical systems theory. Modularity of mind. The big question is, how is a mind organized? We've seen some of how they can be, how the different information processing features could exist. You know, we talked about how neurons can become populations that are capable of processing special things and recognizing patterns and such. Here is a simple diagram of an agent. It has various components that we can recognize as fairly humanish, right? We have perception coming in from the environment on the right, to the sensors in our bodies, right? Various information moves around. This is a very specific kind of agent. We won't linger on it too long, but then it produces actions in the world, right? Is this a mind, though? Not really, because this is a fairly simplified version and it has very little room for things like more complex interaction, right? It's more of a reactionary agent that has its own internal information. But okay, so then how do we get up to a mind? Well, I think we can still take with us some ideas from this model here. Modularity. So this is the concept, a pretty important one in cognitive science, that the mind can be broken up into distinct modules that carry out different functions. So if you think back to some of the localization of function we've looked at before, so different kinds of brain damage make it so that you're unable to either use or name objects depending on where in your brain you were damaged, that's a pretty good indication that there are specific areas of your brain that do different things. So the idea is that modules in your brain can send information to each other, but they do different things to it, right? So, and we have various faculties that might draw on different modules for different things like memory, learning, attention, perception, vision, audition. So, but okay, the idea of modularity is good, but what's the specific layout? Well, there were two theories. There was sort of the de facto theory of horizontal faculties, and that is, well, your brain has all of these different abilities in it somewhere, but each of those is sort of its own nebulously defined mind. It does its own thing. We can study them separately. They can share information. They can all interact. You know, your memory can interact with perception and so on. But there's a newer idea that comes in. The idea of vertical faculties. So while there might be some general integrating overall process, really the bulk of the processing in the mind is in these smaller fixed processors. So Jerry Fodor, old friend, he favors this vertical faculties idea. So the idea is there's lots of evidence for this specialized processing, right? We kind of, that's become clear to us. And there might be more complex skills like insight, but we can leave that in the fairly unspecified realm of the central processor. More specific is that the more specific things that we need to do are in these sort of bundled up, tighter, lower level modules that do hyper specific things like perceive color or analyze shape or recognize a 3D object, or recognize voice or face, right? So the idea is that these low-level modules have some specific features. They're domain-specific, so there's one kind of information allowed in this module. It might change form by the end, but it doesn't just take any information. It takes specific information. The thing that helps you name an object is taking features of that object only. It doesn't take your dad's name. It takes object features, right? It's encapsulated, so it can't be stopped. It can't be tampered with during the process. There's no entry point for more information in these modules. It's mandatory, so it can't be stopped. It's fast. It doesn't wait for new information. These kind of all go together, right? Encapsulated, mandatory, fast means it's its own thing. It has a fixed neural architecture, so the neurons aren't going to change much, and it has a specific breakdown, meaning there are specific errors that are created. You can predict the errors of these modules. So let's look at an illusion, one of my favorite things in all these, to help illustrate what might be a low-level module in your brain. So here are 3 boxes, right? These seem fairly straightforward, right? They're different shapes, almost certainly. The one on the right looks very long. The one on the left looks a little bit more stocky, and the middle one is almost warped a little bit. It's tilted. Not clear which one's the largest or whatever, but they have different shapes to them, right? Well, what if I told you that all the pink lines are the same length? It kind of makes sense now that I'm showing you, right? If you measure it on your screen, it's true. It's true. I just did it myself with my thumb. It's painful to think that the one on the right, the length of it is the same as the length of the width on the one on the left. That's crazy. This is a specific breakdown of one of your low-level modules. This is something, it works, the Shepherd illusion works even when you know better. It's some process in your brain that simply cannot parse the information available in a different way. Another place this happens in the real world is brood parasitism, something to know of. The herring gull gives food to the invasive bird chick despite all evidence that this is not its brood. That bird chick right there is gigantic, right? But the herring gull still feeds it because this other species has learned I can just leave my eggs in this nest. I can smash these eggs and leave my eggs in this nest. And this other bird, despite having certain abilities to detect the world around it, has something in this, that I see an open mouth on a small animal in front of me, on a small bird in front of me, in my nest. I can't shake it. I have to give it food. That's the idea, that these animals are quite simple and they can't unlearn some of these low-level module ideas. So that's the idea, the general idea of modularity of mind. We can break the mind and brain down into these smaller processing units, kind of like Sherdlu, think back to our friend who processed language. And there's plenty of room for complexity, though. Insight, creativity, love, all these more complex things than perceiving the length of an edge. There's still room for that in this modularity of mind idea, that at least the first, Fodor version. But there's plenty of evidence that there's smaller, less flexible processing milling around in there. Now, next evolution, and I use that term specifically. Massive modularity and Darwinian modules. Okay, so moving forward, though, do we actually need that concept of a central process? Isn't every bundle of neurons as part of some small local processing unit? Do we need a central processor? So this is the massive modularity hypothesis. Massive modularity. Every interconnected process in the brain is some hyper-specialized module solving some very specific problems. But they can also share information freely, and that is critical. That's the primary idea here. So instead of a central process being hypothesized here, if any module can share information with any other module, different neural pathways, different connections formed in the brain, then the idea of these more complex faculties like insight and creativity could just be the result of the complexity of those networks. They can have a very complex chain of interaction between all these different modules and create pathways instead of having specific, or rather a general, there's just a mush of general processing somewhere going on, right? So That's the idea. And evolutionary psychologists favor this kind of approach to modularity because it introduces this idea that you can have modules that are Darwinian. They will evolve as you need them, right? So if every little module is connected and every chunk of your brain is connected, is part of a individual module, these new connections are pretty easy to create. Create a new connection between previously established mini modules and repurpose and recombine them into higher order processes like, say, insight or face detection or the following, right? And it gives this very nice forward-facing view of how information processing can improve in organisms over time, over evolution. So let's talk about a wild example that helps to illustrate how this might work in humans, or rather highlights the possibility for one of these evolved modules, evolved pathways in humans. So think this is the Wason selection task. The idea is it's a task testing human skill with predicate logic. Some basics of predicate logic, here we go. You may have heard of some of these before. It's kind of like proofs, right? If P, then Q. That's the basis, right? The premise. If I know that, so if P, then Q. P is true, therefore Q is true, right? That's what this first rule implies. If P, then Q. So if P is true, Q is true. That's called modus ponens. If Q is false, I can then damn well prove that P is also false, modus tollens. There are two invalid ways of arguing from these premises. If Q is true, therefore P is true, that's not valid. That's affirming the consequent. And if P is false, therefore Q is false. That's called denying the antecedent. Let's look at a real example. So take this idea that all tigers have stripes. Okay, let's move. Modus ponens says if this is a tiger, then it does have stripes. So if I know something is a tiger, then I know it has stripes. Modus tollens is if this thing that I'm looking at has no stripes, then I know it's not a tiger because all tigers have stripes. The invalid reasoning, you can see a little more clearly now that we're using something real, is affirming the consequent. If this thing has stripes, then it must be a tiger. And versus the opposite, denying the antecedent. If this is not a tiger, then there's no way it has stripes. How do you explain a candy cane? So that's the idea of this. This is a function, a logical capability that we have as human beings, and it's a real pain in the butt to put down on paper because we're actually not very good at this kind of logic, and I can show you why. So this is the task, the Wason selection task. Which cards need to be turned over to evaluate this premise, whether or not it's true, right? So if a card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other side. So the premise is if vowel, then even. We need to check to make sure that holds, right? Which one of these do I turn over? So each one of these represents a different one of the arguments we saw before. If I turn over E, then we can see if modus ponens is violated, right? Because if I turn E over and there's an odd number on the other side, then this rule doesn't make sense, right? We can't do C because if I turn C over, and it doesn't matter what's on the other side because there's no rule in here about consonants at all. Skip it, denying the antecedent. How about of these two? Which number do I need to turn over? It might feel like 4 because we can, that's better evidence that the vowel is there. No. What we need to know is whether or not the 5 has a vowel on the other side. Affirming the consequent versus see if modus tollens is violated by that. So if I turn the 5 over and there's a C, then that's fine. Nothing has been violated. If I turn the 5 over and there's E or an A, oh shoot, the rule is gone. This is not easy. I'm speeding through it. I would prefer to let you twist in the wind a little bit. Sorry, it's fun for everyone because you learn from the dissonance, right? People screw this up. It's hard. This is a hard thing. Quick recap of it. So if vowel, then even. So E is easy. We get that one immediately. Most people do. C is also easy. You know it's not really related to our vowels. But 4 and 5, 4 kind of feels like it could help because it seems to bear a relationship with the original rule. But the rule doesn't care about consonants. 5 gives us a way to disprove the rule. So, I may have walked you through all that, and this isn't even complex logic, but it's still taxing, right? What's the problem here? Why is this hard? So this is a really abstract problem, right? It involves disproving these single directional relationships. We infer bad rules about it because things look similar and they're of similar categories. We apply bad logic and we really screw it up for the 4 and 5s. But there's a version of this task that we're actually way better at. And it barely requires any explanation to figure out what to do. Whose IDs do we need to check to verify that someone who is drinking alcohol must be over 21, right? If they've got a beer, then they need to be 21. Well, we know we got to check the beer to make sure they're 21, right? Who else do we need to check in here? The 16-year-old right away, right? We know right away that the only person who could violate this rule is the 16-year-old. The 25-year-old, we don't care what they're drinking. And the Coca-Cola person, we don't care how old they are. We care about the 16-year-old. This is wild. So it's identical logic. I didn't change it. The only thing changed here is the cover story. We solve it rapidly, consistently, and intuitively without any effort. What the heck is going on? So, intuitively, in a basic sense, this is just easier because it's grounded in reality, right? The more realistic example just makes more sense, right? But why did our ability to leverage the logic change? How come we didn't just send this off to a logic solving module? Why not just, we've looked at some neural network stuff. Couldn't you just train up a thing that could solve out modus ponens and tollens? There's not that many bits of information going on in this predicate logic stuff. What gives? This is where the Darwinian module concept comes in. So the possible explanation is maybe we have that module, that logical processing going on somewhere in the brain, but it's not really accessible from the abstract word problem parts of our brain. It's only accessible from what is thought of as a cheater detection module, something that would be very useful if you are living in a society of animals that need to share resources and not hurt each other and not cheat each other, right? So what if we have this special system that specifically cares about social settings, and it has this cheater detection module, this domain-specific logical system that engages this kind of logic to identify specifically cheating or flouting a social norm or something, right? This is not neurologically confirmed. That's not the point of this exercise, but it presents this really compelling explanation. Maybe there's no pathway from the boring verbal version of the task to the logic module used. Like, even if we're allowing for this logic module to be separated, maybe there's just no path to it. Maybe you have to engage this cheater detection module or pathway to get there and to leverage it quickly. So, that's the idea of mass modularity, that we could have a wide variety and number of all these tiny moving parts, these little interconnected chunks of mind, as it were, that all do different things, and it's just more or less the way they're all hooked up to each other in complex ways that gives rise to mind. Okay, let's step outside the mind into dynamical systems theory. What is dynamical systems? Okay, so dynamical systems is actually older than cognitive science. It's just a general idea of studying multiple moving agents and bodies in the world and constraints. You can actually think of just, the way the planets move. Those are dynamical systems. They are all kind of bound to each other. They all have different properties and gravities that sort of influence each other, and they all move in a delicate dance in space, right? We can also apply that same thinking to us. But so the idea is that it's stepping away from the concepts of representations. We're not talking about the way that symbols and chunks and data are moved into the brain. We're not really talking about like the complex computations, the algorithms and processes that we can specify for how the brain works. It's more about this interplay of moving agents. So these are Newell's constraints. The task, the organism, and the environment are what help us understand our behavior in the world, our motor behavior, but our behavior in the world. So these different constraints, these different elements of the world around us help us understand how we behave in them. So task constraints are things like whatever we're actually trying to achieve. So what are the valid actions within the task, and what are the most productive actions in the task, right? To catch a ball, for example, moving your arm is pretty good and valid. Kicking is valid, but not really useful, right? The task will define certain ways that you can behave that are meaningful. Organism constraints. So what sort of features does the body actually have? The one that we live in, right? How much muscle do I have? Am I missing a limb? Can I not smell? How tall am I? How good's my vision? Can I balance? Am I hungry or sleepy? Am I Doc? Are there other dwarves here? The idea is that you are embodied, right? So your constraints of how you move and interact with the world are connected to your body. Finally, environment constraints. So what's happening around us? Am I out in the field or am I in my bedroom, right? How much space do I have to move? What's the temperature? How's the noise? Is it dark? All these questions. So this brings us to this sort of embedded cognition idea. The big dynamical systems theory concept is that we are embedded in our environment. So the task, the organism, and the environment are inextricably linked. And if we ignore the task and the environment, and we just focus on the specific neurons of the organism, not even the body, we are missing the vast majority of the story, according to dynamical systems folks. Now, this isn't to downplay the fact that your brain is very complex. That's just straight up observable at this point. We know that. But what they're saying is we must start taking into account the external world as well. So, how is this cognitive? Seems like we're kind of running away from the brain and the mind. Well, we can talk about how this idea applies to a sort of information system that's meaningful, and maybe it will help to illustrate this. So, consider a simple steam engine, right? Just in your mind, just think about a steam engine. Like it produces a big blast of steam to move machinery around, a flywheel, and that flywheel will drive rotational energy and move your train or whatever, right? It's just explosions that are contained. Now, if you don't check the operation of this, you just burn all the fuel all at once and you blast all the steam out, the system literally flies apart. It explodes, right? You need something to govern the release of this energy. If you were going to do this in a computational manner, here's the idea. You would have to measure the speed of the flywheel, compare the actual speed of speed 1 against the desired speed of S2, and then if they are the same, you return to step 1. But if they're not the same, then measure the current steam pressure and calculate the required alteration in steam pressure to reduce it, throttle the adjustment, and now loop, return to step 1, do this over and over. And that's fine. That's the way a digital mechanism would work. That's the way your thermostat in your house works, right? It's doing this little check every tick. The tick maybe is a million times a second or whatever, but it's ticking, it's waiting, it's checking. It's like, oh, it's too hot. I'll engage the system, right? There's a better way to do this. In a steam engine, you can implement what's called a watt governor. The basic idea is that the watt governor it connects the flywheel, the movement of the flywheel itself, the thing being driven by the steam pressure. It connects that movement back to the valve that controls the steam. So what this does is it creates this interconnected system that feeds back in on itself, and it continuously, automatically, and instantaneously keeps itself adjusted to the correct amount. It's based exclusively on the dynamics of this system and the synergies between them, right? The systems all constrain each other, the different parts of the system, to produce what seems to be intelligent regulation, right? It seems like, oh, it's able to adjust and keep track. Haha. It's literally an arm, spindle arm that connects a flywheel and a valve. Interesting. So sometimes a very, very simple entity embedded into a system can produce very complex behavior. So let's extend this into the real cognitive world, a little bit more familiar to us than the explosions inside a steam engine. The watt governor shows you how you can construct these interconnected systems that appear to process information, but they don't necessarily need abstract computation. They don't need step-by-step algorithms to do it. They have just sort of the physical properties that make it good. So whether that can capture all of cognition, we don't need to address that. But it gives you a way of thinking about the relationship of cognition to the world that it lives in. Let's look at catching a ball. Say you want to catch a solid hit in baseball, and we're way out in the outfield, right? We see it going. We see it moving. We need to run both far and fast. We can tell that much at least. But the question is, where and when do you run? What vector on this field of how fast and far and what direction to move do we need to move in to get to the ball's impact location so we can friggin' catch it and get the out that we need, right? Well, there's the computational way of doing this. An information processing manner would have us trying to do things like extract the trajectory and velocity information from vision, solve some physics problems and find its landing position, translate that to a motor plan to get there in time, and then execute that plan. Now, I've shown you a lot of ways that neurons are very powerful and very quick at pattern matching things, but there's a reason we don't do this, and that's because we don't friggin' need to. There's an interesting property of physics and geometry that allows us to use something way simpler to catch a ball, any ball. So, if you move in such a way that the velocity of the ball on your retina is constant, so it's not accelerating, it's just moving up and down like that. It doesn't seem like much, but if you move so that the ball is moving like that on your retina, in your eye, you will end up in a position to catch it. You still got to move your arms correctly to catch it, but you will end up in the location required to catch the ball. Yeah, check it out on your own. You can look into this. Also, even better is that the rate of the expansion of the ball correlates with how long you have until it hits you. We won't talk about that one as much, but the idea is that this is wild because this is just the shape of your eyeball, the way that physics is, the way that movement works in trajectories and physics and trigonometry and geometry. And we can just boil it right down to, hey, if I train my neurons to move my body in such a way that this is maintained, this slow up and down motion, I'll do it again, then I will catch the ball. The critical information is available in the world. It enables these constant, minute corrections. We don't have to be fancy and complex about it. We can just use this free thing, right? It's simple facts of physics. So this helps to illustrate embodied cognition. The idea that your neural systems are always working together with the rest of your bodies and the world to achieve action. And they really shouldn't be separated. Because if you separate them, if you say, how would a brain process the physics simulation needed to, then you are getting at a question that is non-real, right? The brain is never separated from the body in that way. Or we hope it's not. Jeez. So, yes, that's the idea. So we can keep going with this. There's an interesting study we can look at. So human walking. How do we walk? How do we learn to walk? Are we taking in the environment and processing all of it and solving all the necessary like coordination problems, the multidimensional math to actuate all of our arms and legs and stuff to program our bodies? Or are there lots of muscle tensions and free bouncy things? I'm bouncing up and down on my knees right now. Not my knees, but like in place. I'm standing. So the actuators so they're all interconnected. You don't need the central processing unit to do all the math. A lot of that math is coming out for free because your tendons are the way they are. So let's look at this in a study that examined babies. Walking development. So babies show this interesting U shape in their walking behaviors. For the first 2 months, infants try to make stepping motions. They just kind of wiggle their feet. From 2 to 8 months, those behaviors all vanish. And then after 8 months, they actually start to learn actual walking. So the behavior comes back and they get better at it. What's going on here? Well, a standard neural explanation, even neural stuff, sometimes overcomplicates things. These areas need to mature, right? These areas that are responsible for the motion, they need to mature, and they sort of prune some of these things off for a while and let other parts of the brain develop, and then they reemerge, right? So the dynamical systems explanation says, well, walking behaviors are just an emergent product of all the constraints in the world, especially between the organism and the environment. A little less so the task, because they're just kind of doing it at random. So an experiment that would test this and say, okay, wait. Can we change the constraints of the world and on the organism, the baby, to reignite these stepping behaviors? So Dellon and Smith, these experiments, they changed the environment and the behavior comes back. Spoiler. So holding infants upright in warm water, they start to mime the pitter-patter motions of walking again because we have removed some of the gravitational constraints. We've made it easier for the baby to engage in those motions that they might just naturally be doing. Then if you secure them above a mechanical treadmill and let them, let their legs kind of wobble on the treadmill as they go, they start to step again. And they can even adapt to the speed of the treadmill, which is crazy. You wouldn't think that just holding the baby up would allow them to walk. So, I mean, not walk. They're not supporting themselves, but that's the idea. So the neural explanation isn't really supported here. The behavior didn't decay or get pruned away or die off in a certain phase of neural development. It just didn't make any sense to do based on the constraints of the body and of the world. So when you change those constraints, the behavior comes back. Dellon and Smith, again, the variables that they looked at in their models that helped them kind of pinpoint this was leg fat and muscle strength in the baby, and in the environment, gravity and inertia. These are all things that will change over time. So stepping behavior comes back in some areas of this space, this state space, and not in others. So state space, real quick on the side here, you can see there's the question of between leg fat and muscle strength. So this is all just the organism. the question was, if let's say we leave the environment alone and we just watch how the babies develop. Well, in this space, we have muscle strength and leg fat. And as long as muscle strength is more than leg fat, then you're good to go. The walking continues. If leg fat becomes too much and the muscle strength hasn't developed yet, then the state space says, oh, there's no walking happening there. So let's look at our little trajectory again. At first, they're fine because a baby's born, they don't have a whole lot of fat on them. But then soon, babies just start drinking milk or formula or whatever, and they just grow, right? And they're not growing, they're growing a lot more fat than they are growing muscle strength. So you see their trajectory moves up. They're now in the no walkies part of the state space. And then from there, they start to, so now they've got a little fat put on, but now they're actually going to start exercising and doing stuff, right? Babies start to do things. They start moving around a lot. So now they're going to lose a bit of their leg fat, but they're going to rocket up in terms of their muscle strength. So their muscle strength will now exceed, even though they're still pudgy little dudes, the muscle strength comes back and outruns the leg fat. And so now they can start walking again. That's the idea. You can analyze things in terms of these complex spaces where certain behaviors are viable and certain behaviors are not, and then see how things change over time. So that's dynamical systems. It's this more holistic approach. It's less focused on the nature of the mind and its structures and more on the dynamics of neurons, the bodies they're in, their tasks they're trying to do, and the environments in which they're all embedded. So in one way, you could think of this as a sort of behaviorism 2.0, this time with lots more math. But the idea is that the complexity of these systems and their dynamics leaves a lot of room to ask really important empirical questions about the nature of our cognition's place in the world around us, because we cannot separate our brains from our bodies and the world we live in. Now, this doesn't mean that it fully replaces the other information processing mechanisms of the brain. In fact, some of those things almost certainly do their own kind of thing. The questions that we end up asking about how we interface with the world need to be guided by the fact that we live in the world. So, one last thought here. It's pretty important for understanding the kind of the ethos here of, maybe even the pathos of dynamical systems, and that's how it factors in with emergence again, right? So similar to how we've seen individual simple neurons can produce these complex behavior in networks, dynamical systems theories really embrace the concept of emergence by saying we don't always need complex internal structures to explain our mental activity, because we're just one node in the dynamics of the greater network, right? Maybe our cognitive processes are only ever as complex as they need to be to catch the ball. Maybe we're just ants on the beach. Final thought. What's another way you interact with your environment that could be less complicated than you think when you consider the fact that your processing can incorporate the constraints of your task, your environment, and your body? All right, that's it. Thanks so much. Take care.